For 18 months, Betty has been deceived from America and caged in Iran with her daughter. She has been humiliated beyond measure, stripped of her passport, her rights, and her dignity. Every day, she wakes in a stranger's home that was once called family. Every night, she lies next to her terrified child, listening for footsteps that could mean punishment or worse. She is watched, followed, threatened. She cannot speak freely. She cannot leave the house alone. In the eyes of the Iranian legal system, she is no longer a mother with rights. She is now property, belonging to the man who betrayed her trust and made her a prisoner in a foreign land. That man is her husband. Her name is Moody. She came to Iran with a promise, a short visit so her daughter could meet her father's family. But that promise was a lie. And when the door closed behind them, it was not just a house they entered. It was a cage. Her daughter, Mahtob, is just 4 years old. She cries for her brothers back home in Michigan. She misses her school. She can't understand why her mother keeps whispering, "We're leaving soon," but never actually leaves. Betty tried the embassy. She begged relatives. She planned quiet exits and safe words with taxi drivers. Every time she was met with silence or betrayal. In this land, a father's word is law. A mother's plea is nothing. Then came the final warning. If you try to escape again, her husband told her, "You'll never see your daughter alive." That was the breaking point. Betty knew she couldn't wait any longer. With no passport, no money, and no allies, she turned to strangers, risking everything to make one last run through the icy mountains of Iran, with a sick child on her back and fear in her throat. This is not a movie. This is not fiction. This is a real story of a mother who crossed deserts and borders, defied foreign laws, and walked through snow in the dead of winter, just to give her daughter freedom. It is a story of control, captivity, betrayal. But more than anything, it is a story of courage. Welcome to the Crime Series. Before we begin, do us a quick favor. Drop your location and the time you're watching this in the comments. We want to know where you're tuning in from, because these stories matter everywhere. Like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. This story was inspired by the real-life journey of Betty Moody, a courageous American mother whose personal testimony brought global attention to the dangers of international parental abduction, forced confinement, and legal injustice across borders. Betty's unwavering strength in the face of betrayal and her daring escape to protect her daughter Mahtob motivated the creation of this narrative. Her voice and her daughter's continue to echo as powerful reminders of what love, faith, and determination can overcome. If you wish to explore the full account of their story, we encourage you to read their deeply moving memoirs, Not Without My Daughter, 1987, by Betty Moody with William Hoffer. For the Love of a Child, 1992, by Betty Moody. My Name is Mahtob, 2015, by Mahtob Moody. These books offer a first-hand look into the 18-month captivity in Iran, the emotional and physical toll of separation, and the heroic efforts it took to escape and begin again. We express our deepest gratitude to Betty and Mahtob Moody for sharing their truth, and for being the enduring light behind this story. Elizabeth Betty Lover was born on June 9, 1945, in Alma, a small town in central Michigan. She grew up in a modest, working-class family. Her father worked in construction and her mother was a homemaker. Betty learned the values of hard work, discipline, and family responsibility early in life. Her upbringing was shaped by small-town traditions and a strong sense of community. As a child, Betty was curious, observant, and independent. She enjoyed reading and helping her mother with chores. She attended public school in Alma, where she performed well academically. She was especially drawn to English and the social sciences. She had a natural sense of empathy and showed early interest in helping others, which later led her into nursing and social work. Betty married young, in her early 20s. Her first marriage was to an American man, with whom she had 2 sons, Joe and John. The marriage eventually ended in divorce. Details about her first husband remain private and are not publicly documented, but it is known that Betty raised her 2 sons largely on her own for several years. As a single mother, she balanced parenting with her professional responsibilities. She trained and worked as a registered nurse and later became involved in hospital administration. Betty was known for being responsible, organized, and committed to her job. Her coworkers described her as reliable, with a strong sense of integrity. By all accounts, Betty was independent, practical, and protective of her children. She wasn't actively looking for a new relationship, but her life changed when she met a man named Syed Bozorg Mahmoudi, known simply as Moody. Moody was an Iranian-born doctor who had come to the United States in 1961. He was educated in the American medical system and became a licensed anesthesiologist. Fluent in English and deeply familiar with American culture, Moody presented himself as warm, intelligent, and well-traveled. He was charming and polite. He also had a commanding presence and could talk about science, medicine, and politics with ease. To Betty, he seemed like someone who had both brains and ambition. They met while working at the same hospital. Betty admired his dedication to his patients. Moody would sometimes speak emotionally about how difficult life had been in Iran and how much better it was in America. He made it clear he had chosen the U.S. as his permanent home. Betty appreciated his outward respect for women, his foreign sophistication, and the fact that he seemed to care about her children. They started dating. Moody took a special interest in Betty's sons, which won her trust. Her children also seemed to like him. As their relationship grew more serious, Moody proposed. Betty was hesitant at first. She was a Christian and he was a practicing Muslim, but Moody reassured her that religion would never be a problem. Eventually, Betty agreed to marry him. They had a small, simple wedding in 1977. Betty became Mrs. Mahmoudi, and Moody became a stepfather. Not long after, their daughter Mahtob was born in 1979. Her name means moonlight in Farsi. Moody was overjoyed at her birth and doted on her. Betty was hopeful that her second marriage would work out better than her first. In the early years, things seemed stable. They moved to Alpena, Michigan, a small town where Moody took a position at a local hospital. Betty helped manage his office and worked part-time to support the family. They were not wealthy, but they lived comfortably. From the outside, they looked like a multicultural, hard-working American family. But over time, cracks began to form. Moody's personality began to shift. According to Betty, the change was gradual but undeniable. The man who once made her feel safe began to make her feel trapped. She noticed he was becoming more controlling, not just in their home, but in how she interacted with the outside world. Betty noticed he had a double standard. He still expected to be treated like the man of the house, but refused to listen to her opinions. He became critical of her American friends, her parenting, and even her faith. Friends began to drift away. Moody would question her decisions, criticize her behavior, and often accuse her of being too American or too independent. Conversations that once felt normal turned into tense exchanges. He would often dominate discussions and shut her down. Moody's mood swings became more frequent and more intense. At times, he would shower Betty with affection. Other times, he was cold, withdrawn, or sharply critical. Betty began walking on eggshells. She didn't know which version of her husband she would encounter each day. He became increasingly impatient with the children and started raising his voice more often. Betty noted that his temper could flare up without warning. His emotional instability was further complicated by deep identity conflicts. He admired America's technology and education system, yet he held on to strict cultural and religious beliefs from his homeland. These contradictions seemed to weigh heavily on him. He would complain about racism in the medical field, and at times, he blamed Betty or American society for his professional frustrations. His pride in his Iranian heritage began to overtake his desire to live a peaceful life in the United States. By the early 1980s, Moody's professional life had also become unstable. He faced difficulties in his medical career, including the loss of hospital positions and reduced income. These setbacks intensified his bitterness and isolation. Betty tried to be supportive, but the emotional strain on their marriage grew heavier. Moody also started showing signs of paranoia. He accused Betty of trying to poison him or plotting against him. At times, he expressed fear that the American government was against him. Moody once drilled a hole through the floor of their house to listen in on voices from the basement, though there was nothing there. These were not the actions of a man under stress, they were signs of deeper mental deterioration. As his anger and suspicion grew, so did his control. Betty was no longer allowed to take Mahtob out of the house alone. Moody insisted on knowing where she was at all times. He began to talk about Iran more often, describing it as a place where family meant everything and women stayed home and obeyed their husbands. He praised the discipline of Iranian children and criticized American parenting. When Betty challenged him, he called her selfish or ungrateful. The warning signs became clearer to Betty, but she remained hopeful that he would recover emotionally or regain his balance. She still believed that their love and shared parenthood could pull them through. But behind closed doors, her life was shrinking. She had gone from being a confident, independent woman to someone increasingly cut off from her own support system. In public, Moody could still present himself as calm and composed. He was a respected physician with degrees from American institutions, but in private, his behavior toward Betty grew more erratic and unpredictable. At home, Betty did her best to protect Mahtob from the tension. She wanted to give her daughter a happy, stable childhood, like the one she had growing up in Michigan. She focused on routines, education, and love. Mahtob was attending Montessori school, enjoying time with her grandparents, and thriving in her environment. Then Moody made a proposal. He wanted to visit Iran. It had been nearly a decade since he had seen his family. He said his mother had passed away, and it was important for him to return home and grieve properly. He wanted Betty and Mahtob to come with him. He insisted that it would be just a 2-week vacation, no more. They would stay with his relatives, visit key places, and return to the U.S. in time for Mahtob to start the school year. Betty's immediate reaction was alarm. Iran was in the middle of the Iran-Iraq War. Air raids, rationing, and religious crackdowns were daily reality. And since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran had become a theocratic state with strict laws, especially for women. The U.S. had no diplomatic presence in Iran since the hostage crisis. Betty, a Western woman, married to an Iranian man, would have no legal rights once she stepped off the plane. She knew that under Iranian law, her husband would have sole authority over their daughter. If he chose to keep them in the country, there would be no legal recourse. She brought up her fears with Moody. His response was dismissive. He told her she was being paranoid. He said it was disrespectful to his culture and family to refuse. He reminded her that he had lived in the U.S. for more than 20 years and had always returned after visiting Iran. He said it would just be 2 weeks. Nothing more. He even promised it, verbally and repeatedly. Still, Betty was cautious. She began asking around. She spoke to friends and co-workers, telling them the plan. Some urged her to be careful. A few strongly advised against it. One woman reminded her that American women married to Middle Eastern men had been stranded in other countries after vacations that turned into permanent detainment. Another told her, once you're in Iran, your rights as an American disappear. If your husband keeps you there, there's nothing anyone can do. Betty decided to confront Moody again. I'll go with you, she said, but only if you promise we're coming back in 2 weeks. Not later, not longer. 2 weeks exactly. He agreed. Betty made sure the return tickets were in order. She kept them safe and told her sons, Joe and John, from her previous marriage, that they were just going to London, not Iran. Her parents, especially her father who was battling colon cancer, were told the same. She didn't want them to worry. To them, she simply said they were taking a short European trip as a family. That decision would later haunt her. She packed light. 2 weeks didn't require much. Some gifts for the relatives, a few changes of clothes, and some basic supplies for Mahtob. Moody insisted Betty also pack a headscarf and conservative clothing, long sleeves and a skirt that covered her ankles. Iranian law required modest dress in public. She didn't argue. She figured it was temporary. As they prepared to leave, Moody's behavior became strangely upbeat. He was more talkative than usual. He seemed excited, like someone who had waited a long time for something. It was the happiest Betty had seen him in months. But something about it didn't sit right. The flight took off in early August 1984. They flew British Airways, with a stopover in London before heading into Tehran. Betty sat beside her 6-year-old daughter, who dozed off during the long flight, her red-brown curls bouncing as she leaned into her mother. Moody sat across the aisle, reading. In the airplane lavatory, Betty looked into the mirror. Her face looked tired. At 39, she had thought she'd be in a different place. Professionally, emotionally. She tried to shake off the anxiety. "It's just 2 weeks," she told herself. She pulled on the conservative green suit Moody had asked her to wear and wrapped the scarf tightly around her head, knotting it under her chin. She glanced again at her reflection. It didn't feel like herself. She looked like someone she didn't recognize. She returned to her seat and found Moody unusually quiet. "I've been thinking," he said. "We should hide our American passports. If the Iranian authorities see them, they might take them away." Betty hesitated. "Why would they take them?" "They don't like Americans," Moody replied. "Let me hold them. They're more likely to search you than me." Reluctantly, she handed them over. That was the last time she saw those passports for a long time. As the plane began its descent into Tehran, the captain warned passengers of the sharp drop needed to clear the mountain ranges. Mahtob woke up suddenly, startled. Betty squeezed her hand and told her everything would be okay. Outside, the city stretched out in the early morning heat. Betty could feel the pressure already. She was entering a country where she couldn't speak the language, didn't know the customs, and had no legal protection. But she held on to Moody's words. 2 weeks. Once the plane landed, the family stepped into a thick wave of humidity and noise. The stench of sweat and diesel hung in the air. Crowds of people pushed through customs. Women were cloaked head to toe in black chadors. Security officers barked commands. It was nothing like the orderly airports she knew. Mahtob immediately needed a restroom. Betty took her to the terminal's facilities, only to find a concrete floor, a hole in the ground, and filth everywhere. The smell was unbearable. Mahtob cried, "It smells too bad," and refused to go. Betty led her daughter back to Moody. He was calm, unfazed. They waited at baggage claim for hours. Relatives began flooding into the terminal, crying, kissing, hugging. One man took Moody into a tight embrace. "Dabby John," he cried. "Dear uncle." Moody wept. For a moment, Betty felt sympathy. This was his home. Then something unexpected happened. Moody quietly passed the American passports and a wad of cash to the man, who slipped them into his coat. Betty watched it happen. She said nothing, but the fear returned. They eventually left the airport and were driven to the home of Moody's sister, Aimee Bozorg. Then came the moment Betty had been dreading. They stepped outside into the blazing Tehran heat, only to be swarmed by more than 100 members of Moody's extended family. The relatives cried out loudly, threw flowers, hugged, kissed, and wept. Women wailed as they touched Betty's face. Mahtob was scooped up by strangers she had never met. Cameras flashed. Everyone shouted over one another in Farsi. At the center of it all was Aimee Bozorg, Moody's older sister, the matriarch who had raised him after their parents died. She was a large woman, covered in a thick black chador, her face weathered, her teeth stained and crooked, and her hooked nose unmistakable. She clung to Moody, wrapping her arms and legs around him as though she would never let him go. For Betty, the image was both emotional and unsettling. This was no ordinary welcome. The volume, the physicality, and the complete disregard for personal space overwhelmed her. She tried to smile, she tried to be polite, but she felt trapped. She had already begun to sense that something was very wrong. The family guided them to an old turquoise 1970s Chevrolet, festooned with more flowers. As they climbed in, Betty noticed a fresh pool of blood on the driveway. Mahtob gasped. "Mommy," she cried. Betty turned and saw that a sheep had just been slaughtered in their honor. a traditional welcome ceremony. According to custom, guests were expected to walk across the blood before entering the home, a symbolic gesture of blessing. Betty refused. Moody insisted. "It's respect," he told her. Reluctantly, she picked up Mahtob and stepped over the blood. Inside the two-story family home, Betty was instructed to remove her shoes. She did so, following Moody and Mahtob into the large front hall, which was layered with thick Persian carpets. But there was no furniture. People sat on the floor. Meals were served on sofras, oilcloths spread directly onto the carpets. The house was crowded with over 40 people, all relatives. The walls were bare, the air thick with the smell of cooking oil, sweat, and incense. Betty and Mahtob were shown to a small room at the end of a hallway. Two thin, sagging twin beds were pushed together. The shared bathroom down the hall was infested with cockroaches, and the toilet was a hole in the floor with a hose attached to the wall instead of toilet paper. The sink had no soap, and the mirror was cracked. Still, Betty tried to stay calm. "It's just 2 weeks," she reminded herself. "We can do this." But the next morning she was woken before dawn by the Islamic call to prayer. Over loudspeakers, the azan rang out across the city, followed by the sounds of chanting inside the house. Moody was already awake, performing wudu, the ritual cleansing before prayer. Ame Bozorg and Baba Haji, her husband, chanted Quranic verses loudly in different rooms of the house. Mahtob, disturbed by the sound, began to cry softly. "It's okay," Betty whispered. "It's just morning prayers." Later that day, Ame Bozorg presented Betty with a manto and a thick green rosary. "This is what we wear," Moody translated. "You will need to wear this from now on." Betty had already worn a headscarf for the flight, but this coat was heavier, thicker, and unbearably hot. "It's just for outside?" she asked. "Yes," Moody said. But that wasn't true. Within days, it became clear that even inside the house, Betty was expected to remain covered whenever men were present. And in a house with dozens of relatives coming and going, that meant almost all the time. She quickly noticed a pattern of control. The women of the house rose early, cooked in sweltering kitchens, scrubbed pots on the floor, and rarely spoke unless spoken to. All decisions about food, outings, shopping, or even bedtime were made by men or by Ame Bozorg. Every day brought more guests, more customs, and more expectations. Betty tried to stay composed, even as she was repeatedly scolded for drinking her tea without sugar, or sitting improperly, or making eye contact with older men. The cultural rules were strict, and no room was given for foreignness. Betty was told, repeatedly and without warmth, "You're in Iran now, you follow our ways." Mahtob, too, began to suffer. The mosquitoes bit her relentlessly, leaving red welts on her arms and legs. She developed diarrhea from the unfamiliar food. She was given tea instead of water and sweets as distraction, but the stress was wearing on her. The little girl who had once danced in church halls and whispered bedtime prayers now sat quietly, withdrawn, clutching her bunny. Betty noticed something else. Moody, who once joked, laughed, and debated in English, was now changing. He stopped translating conversations, spoke mostly in Farsi, and began correcting Betty in front of others. "Cover your head better," he told her. "Don't shame me." He started praying 5 times a day, often alongside his relatives. He called Mahtob by her full Persian name, and he began referring to Betty as my wife, rather than using her name. Slowly, he was becoming someone else. Betty's instincts were warning her. This was no vacation. This was not about family. There were no plans made for return tickets, and Moody had not once spoken of going back to America. Each evening, more guests arrived for dinner. The routine was the same. Wash hands with a hose, sit on the floor, eat with hands, and leave silently. Betty was told not to speak during prayers. If she questioned anything, she was told it was disrespectful. And still, she kept reminding herself, "Just get through the 2 weeks, then we'll go home." But deep down, she already knew the truth. Tehran was not a stopover. It was a trap. Then, one afternoon, as Betty and Mahtob sat quietly in their shared bedroom, Moody entered and closed the door. He looked calm, even firm. What he said next changed the course of their lives. "We're not going back," he said. Betty stared at him, not fully understanding. What do you mean we're not going back? We have tickets. No, he said. We live here now. This is our home. Mahtob will be raised here, with her family. You will learn to accept it. Betty froze. Her mind raced. She tried to stay calm. What about my sons? She asked. She had 2 boys from a previous marriage, both still in the United States. They're waiting. They're expecting me back. You made your choice when you came here, Moody said. You're my wife. Mahtob is my daughter. This is where we belong. Betty begged him. Just give me a date. 5 years, 10 years. Please, don't say never. He looked her in the eye and said, never. I don't ever want to hear about America again. That night, Betty couldn't sleep. Her mind was spinning. She realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. Moody had planned this. He had waited until they were deep inside Iran, far from any American authority, and then he took away her freedom. He had lied. He had stolen her passport and Mahtob's. He had stripped them of their ability to leave. Under Iranian law, it was even worse. By marrying an Iranian man, Betty was now legally considered an Iranian citizen. So was Mahtob. And in Iran, only the father had the legal right to decide a child's future. A mother had no authority. She could not take Mahtob out of the country without Moody's written permission. If she tried, she could be arrested, or worse. Betty was a hostage. The next day, Moody acted like nothing had happened. He talked to relatives. He ate meals. He read the Quran aloud with his brother-in-law. He ignored Betty's distress. Every time she brought up returning to America, he shut her down. Betty began to understand the full extent of the trap. There was no U.S. embassy in Iran. Only the Swiss embassy operated as a protecting power for American citizens. But communication was limited and risky. She didn't speak the language. She didn't know who to trust. Meanwhile, Moody began to control every part of her life. He insisted she cover her head indoors. He told her when to eat, when to shower, and when to speak. He took away any money she had left. He refused to let her walk outside without him or one of his relatives. She was watched constantly. The more she pushed back, the more aggressive he became. He yelled at her. He called her names. Once, he told her he'd send Mahtob away to live with relatives if Betty didn't behave. Another time, he told Mahtob that her mother didn't love her, that she wanted to leave without her. Betty tried to hide her emotions, but Mahtob could see the pain. The little girl clung to her mother constantly. She was bitten all over by insects. Her skin broke out. She cried often. She missed her brothers. She missed her home. In private, Betty kept track of the days. What began as a countdown to their return flight had now turned into a calendar of captivity. Each day was a reminder that she was further from safety, from her parents, from her sons. One night, after another heated argument, Moody slammed a door and left Betty trembling in the corner of the room. She held Mahtob close and whispered, "I will never leave without you, I promise." But she had no plan, no contacts, no money. No idea how to escape a country at war controlled by religious police and where foreigners, especially Americans, were watched. Still, she knew she had to try. As the days turned into weeks, Betty began studying everything. She memorized street names. She observed which relatives seemed more sympathetic. She practiced smiling even when she was scared. She began teaching Mahtob how to stay silent in dangerous situations. She told her stories that planted hope about freedom, about Michigan, about Grandma and Grandpa. There were moments when she considered trying to run alone, just to get help. But every time she thought of leaving Mahtob behind, even temporarily, she broke down. She had made a promise. She would not leave Iran without her daughter. The final proof that Moody had never intended to return to the U.S. came when she asked about their new furniture, the sets they had bought together in Tehran. Moody had once said he would ship them back to the States. Now he dismissed the topic. Betty understood it then. They had never been going back. He had known it from the beginning. Betty had no legal rights as a wife, either. In Iran's theocratic system, rooted in Shiite Islamic law, a woman could not file for divorce without her husband's approval. She could not travel, work, or open a bank account without his consent. Moody held all the power. He kept her under constant surveillance, took her documents, and told her plainly that she belonged to him and to Iran. When Betty tried to seek help, she found there were no neutral institutions. There was no court that would hear her case fairly. The religious courts were run by male clerics, many of whom viewed Western women with contempt. Their rulings were based on Sharia law, not civil rights. In this system, a woman's testimony carried half the weight of a man's. That meant if Betty claimed abuse and Moody denied it, his word prevailed. Betty also discovered that Moody's family supported the system. His sister, Ame Bozorg, reinforced religious obedience and household control. Any opposition from Betty was seen not as concern for her child, but as rebellion against Islamic duty. The rules of the household mirrored those of the nation: obedience, silence, and total submission to male authority. Even if Betty had found a way to escape alone, she knew she could never leave Mahtob behind. But under Iranian law, custody automatically went to the father. A mother had no standing. If she tried to flee with her child and was caught, Mahtob could be permanently taken from her, and Betty could be jailed or worse. By late 1984, Betty Mahmoudi's life had been completely overturned. What began as a 2-week family vacation to Iran had turned into a situation that no American consulate could easily fix. Betty and her 6-year-old daughter Mahtob were trapped in Tehran. Her husband, Dr. Syed Bozorg Moody Mahmoudi, had declared that they would not be returning to the United States. Betty knew that if she was ever going to leave, she had to do it secretly and without making a single mistake. In the early weeks of their confinement, Betty's options were limited. Moody had placed her under near constant watch, either directly or through his sister, Ame Bozorg. Betty was not allowed to speak to anyone freely. She was monitored inside the house, escorted on errands, and denied private time with friends or teachers. But as time passed, she learned to move carefully. She memorized bus routes, timed school pickups, and began reaching out subtly to people who might be able to help. She found a small group of sympathetic Iranian women and teachers at Mahtob's school. These individuals, though limited by the regime, listened without judgment. One woman, a teacher with knowledge of the outside world, warned Betty to be careful. "Don't speak to the wrong person," she said. "If someone reports you, they won't question what your husband has done. They'll only ask why you tried to run." It was through cautious outreach that Betty learned about Helen Balasanian, a translator and humanitarian who sometimes assisted foreign nationals in distress. Helen became a quiet, steady presence in Betty's desperate planning. With Helen's help, Betty managed to make discreet contact with the Swiss embassy, which represented American interests in Iran after the U.S. embassy was closed in 1979. But even this small step was dangerous. Approaching the embassy meant traveling through Tehran with Mahtob, passing security checkpoints, avoiding surveillance, and ensuring Moody or his relatives didn't follow her. Betty timed her movement carefully, sometimes pretending to be shopping or taking Mahtob to school, all while hiding her true objective. The Swiss embassy staff listened to Betty's story. They were sympathetic, but limited by diplomatic rules and Iranian sovereignty. They told her what she feared most. Under Iranian law, she and Mahtob were not American citizens anymore. As far as Iran was concerned, they were Moody's dependents. Unless he gave written consent, no one could authorize her departure. The embassy could not protect her, could not intervene, and could not even shelter her inside its walls. She asked what would happen if she tried to flee with her daughter. The answer was clear: she would be charged with abducting a child. Iranian authorities could arrest her. Mahtob could be taken away permanently. And if she was found to be acting against her husband or the Islamic Republic, the penalty could be execution. The message was chilling. Betty was alone. Even with that knowledge, Betty refused to give up. She continued reaching out to trusted locals who were aware of underground escape routes. She made contact with smugglers, people who knew how to cross the mountainous border between Iran and Turkey. These smugglers helped others escape political persecution and war. Their services came at a cost, both financially and physically. But they offered the only chance Betty and Mahtob had. One early escape plan failed. A driver was arranged to take Betty and Mahtob from Tehran to the Pakistani border. The plan had been set carefully. Mahtob would be picked up from school. Betty would leave the house unnoticed. But on the day of the escape, Moody changed his routine. He insisted on taking Mahtob to school himself. Betty's heart sank. Somehow, he knew. No one said anything directly, but it was clear the plan had been compromised. Betty said nothing either. She went about her day pretending nothing had changed, knowing that her life and her daughter's now depended on secrecy. At home, Betty's world was shrinking. She was often confined to their small apartment or the house of Moody's sister. She avoided speaking freely, knowing even a child's innocent remark could be overheard and reported. Mahtob, though young, understood the danger. Betty had taught her to be silent around certain people, to keep secrets, and to watch for signs of trouble. Moody's behavior became increasingly volatile. Sometimes he was calm and affectionate. Other times he erupted in anger or tried to manipulate Betty emotionally. He told her that if she wanted to return to the US, she could, but Mahtob would stay. He even tried to book her a solo flight. Betty refused. She had made a promise. She would never leave Iran without her daughter. By early 1986, Betty knew she couldn't rely on legal systems. Every institution had failed her. What remained was determination, courage, and the will to act. She was willing to risk arrest, exile, or even death. But she would not abandon Mahtob. Her only hope was to escape illegally, through the mountains, using the smugglers she had been quietly organizing with for months. She had sought allies. Some helped, some listened, others turned away. But the final decision was hers. To survive and protect Mahtob, she would now become her own rescuer. What Betty did next was not impulsive. It was the result of quiet, desperate planning over several months. Every move had to be calculated. Speaking too openly could cost her and her daughter their lives. So she whispered when she could, passed notes when it was safe, and relied only on a few trusted Iranians, people who understood her fear and were willing to help. These allies introduced her to an underground escape network, a group of people who secretly assisted women, political refugees, and minority families trapped under Iran's restrictive laws. Most of them had no formal ties to any organization. They had nothing to gain and everything to lose if caught. Many were Kurdish guides familiar with the treacherous terrain between Iran and Turkey. Some acted out of compassion, others were motivated by money, but all of them knew the risks. The escape route would be brutal. The plan was for Betty and 6-year-old Mahtob to cross the snow-covered mountains into Turkey, on foot and illegally. The smugglers made no promises. One of them told her plainly, "You might not survive. The weather is too dangerous." Betty knew the dangers. She also knew that staying could mean losing Mahtob forever. Still, she decided to move forward. The connection to the smugglers came through intermediaries linked to the Swiss embassy in Tehran. While the Swiss could not offer asylum or formal protection, they helped pass messages, offered quiet guidance, and acted as a bridge to people who could assist in planning an escape. Through this channel, Betty reached out to those who could organize the route, arrange the guides, and time the crossing. The process took weeks. Every detail had to be secret. Every step carried risk. To fund the escape, Betty used what little she had. Moody had not completely cut her off from access to money, though he monitored her closely. Over time, Betty managed to hide some cash. She also used a credit account that had not yet expired. Through her contacts, she arranged to borrow thousands of US dollars to pay the smugglers, money she promised to repay once back in the United States. She also began preparing mentally. She knew the risks. She could be caught. She could be killed. Mahtob might be taken from her forever. But the alternative, staying in Iran and raising her daughter under repression, control, and fear, was unacceptable. At home, Betty continued acting like everything was normal. Moody could not suspect anything. She went about her daily routines, careful to avoid arousing suspicion. When she did venture out with Mahtob, she tried to gather information, mapping out areas, gauging the mood of people in shops and markets. She became more alert to every detail, listening closely to how people talked about travel, border patrols, and weather conditions. She could not tell Mahtob the full truth, but she tried to prepare her. She said that they might be going on a long trip and that it might be cold and uncomfortable. She encouraged Mahtob to be brave and listen carefully. At just 6 years old, Mahtob understood more than she let on. She had seen and heard enough to know they weren't safe. Her trust in her mother was complete. Before we continue, if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, take a moment to support this documentary. Click the like button. It helps this story reach more people. Subscribe for more true stories of survival, courage, and justice. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read everyone. The journey began on January 26, 1986. Betty and Mahtob left their house under the guise of visiting a friend. Betty packed only the essentials: heavy clothes, food, money, their forged documents. Just before they left, she prayed. Not for a miracle, but for strength. Moody believed she had accepted her fate. He didn't know she was leaving for good. Hidden in a car, they traveled away from Tehran, slipping past military checkpoints where guards often inspected vehicles at gunpoint. Every stop was a moment of tension. Betty's heart raced each time a guard peered inside the car. She had covered herself in a chador, knowing her American accent or a mistake could end everything. Mahtob sat quietly, clutching her bag and her stuffed bunny, pretending to be asleep. After hours on the road, they reached the base of the mountains near the Turkish border. From here, vehicles couldn't go further. The smugglers met them quietly. Betty was handed a long scarf and gloves. They gave Mahtob thick socks and wrapped her in wool. It was winter, and the mountains were covered in snow. The path ahead was not a road. It was a trail used by villagers, traders, and resistance fighters. It climbed through forest, rocks, and open stretches exposed to wind and snowstorms. Betty was not prepared for the physical test. The cold was sharp and unforgiving. Every step on the frozen ground burned her lungs. She was not an athlete, not a climber. Her boots were not made for deep snow. She slipped more than once and bruised her legs. Her feet blistered. Her hands were raw. Mahtob, wrapped tightly in her mother's coat, barely complained. "Mommy, is this the way to Michigan?" she asked once. Betty said yes. That answer kept them going. The smugglers moved fast. They were used to these trails. They carried little and rarely spoke. During the day, the group rested in old huts or behind rocky ledges. At night, they walked under the stars. There were no campfires, no flashlights, no loud voices. Any noise could alert Iranian patrols or border guards, who often shot at suspects without warning. On the second night, the group crossed a river. The bridge had collapsed, so they waded through. Betty lifted Mahtob above the water and carried her on her back. The water soaked Betty to the waist. She was freezing, but she didn't stop. Her lips turned blue. She bit the inside of her cheek to stay focused. They kept walking. By day 3, Betty was limping. Her muscles ached so badly she could barely move. Mahtob had frost on her eyebrows. The smugglers gave them small pieces of bread and boiled tea. Betty's legs buckled that night. She fell to her knees and gasped for breath. One of the guides pulled her up and said in broken English, "No, stop. You stop, you die." Still, Betty pushed forward. Every night, she whispered prayers to herself. "God, please get us out. Please keep her safe." The thought of being captured haunted her. On day 4, the wind picked up. Snow whipped across the trail. The group had to stop in a shallow cave to wait out the gusts. Betty wrapped Mahtob in a blanket and held her tightly. They had run out of food. Betty gave Mahtob her last biscuit. The girl didn't want to eat it, but Betty insisted. "You're stronger than me," she said. The smugglers grew worried. They had heard movement nearby, possibly guards. One said they needed to change route. The detour added 2 more hours of climbing. Betty was dizzy. She vomited once, likely from stress and cold, but she didn't ask to rest. That night, Mahtob looked up at the sky and whispered, "We're almost there, right?" Betty nodded. Almost. On the 5th day, the snow lightened. They reached a ridge that looked over into eastern Turkey. The terrain was still rough, but the threat of Iranian patrols was behind them. One smuggler pointed to the distance. Van, he said. It was a city, small but safe. Once in Van, they could take a bus to Ankara. That final descent into Turkey was steep and slow. Betty nearly fell several times. Her legs were shaking. Mahtob kept her head down and focused on her steps. When they reached the bottom, the smugglers led them to a small shelter near a road. A contact helped them board a bus. Their clothes were soaked, their fingers cracked from the cold. Betty covered Mahtob with her scarf and sat silently for hours as the bus rolled into Ankara, the capital. On the cold morning of February 5, 1986, after a 5-day escape over the Iranian-Turkish mountains, on horseback, on foot, and through freezing winds, Betty Moody and her 6-year-old daughter Mahtob reached Ankara, Turkey. Exhausted, bruised, and emotionally raw, they went straight to the U.S. Embassy, clutching emergency passports issued by the Swiss embassy in Tehran. The guards let them inside. Betty could barely speak. Mahtob looked pale but calm, holding tightly to her mother's hand. A U.S. official asked for their travel documents. Betty handed over the newly issued papers. There were no Iranian exit stamps, which meant, under Turkish law, they were now illegal aliens. The official looked concerned. He informed Betty she might need to report to the local police station, but Betty refused. "If I go there, they might send us back," she said firmly. She explained everything, how her husband had held them against their will in Iran, how she was abused, how she escaped with the help of strangers, and how she could not risk being sent back. The official listened without interruption. Then calmly, he told her he would handle it. They were offered food. Betty couldn't eat. Her nerves were still in survival mode. Her biggest fear was deportation. If the Turkish government alerted Iran, Moody could find them. She never let Mahtob out of her sight, watching every hallway, every door. Several tense hours later, the official returned. "You're cleared," he said. "We'll get you on the next flight." For the first time since the nightmare began, Betty cried, not from pain or fear, but from relief. The fear that had gripped her for 18 months finally loosened its hold. They were going home. Their route home included stops in Munich, New York, and finally Detroit. In Munich, the airline provided a hotel room and warm meals. At breakfast, Mahtob picked up a bowl of raspberries and smiled. "You're teasing me," she said. "I know we're in Michigan, because these are real raspberries." From Munich, they flew to New York, where delays caused them to miss their final connection to Detroit. Betty and Mahtob spent the night at the airport, resting in plastic chairs, too afraid to sleep. Betty stayed awake all night, watching over her daughter, unwilling to let her out of her sight. She had just risked both their lives to escape a country that had claimed ownership over her child. Even on U.S. soil, she could not relax. When they finally landed in Detroit Metropolitan Airport, Betty's family was waiting, their arms full of flowers, candy bars, and dolls. For months, they hadn't known if she and Mahtob were alive. The last they had heard from her over 6 months earlier, Betty had begged them to help her escape. But communication was scarce, monitored, or impossible. Their sudden arrival felt unreal. Her family had prepared for disappointment. Many thought something had gone wrong. Her father, Frank Lover, was terminally ill with colon cancer. He had undergone multiple surgeries and endured chemotherapy. Doctors had not expected him to live long. But he had clung to life with a single purpose, to see Betty and Mahtob safe again. When they arrived at the house in rural Bannister, Michigan, he insisted on performing one last ritual. Hiding behind the bathroom door, barely able to stand, he called out his traditional boo to Mahtob, a greeting they had shared since her infancy. Mahtob giggled through her exhaustion. It was a sacred moment. Her mother, Helen, had prepared Mahtob's favorite pies, blueberry and banana cream. In the living room, surrounded by her siblings and their spouses, Betty felt the overwhelming contrast between the quiet Michigan winter and the heat, noise, and danger she had left behind in Tehran. The reunion with her sons, Joe and John, was equally emotional. Joe had turned 20 while she was in Iran. John was now nearly 16 and had grown several inches taller in her absence. They had lived without her for 18 months, not knowing if they would ever see her again. Yet beneath the joy of the reunion, Betty remained on high alert. She was not legally safe. In the eyes of Iranian law, both she and Mahtob were still considered Iranian citizens. Moody still held legal rights over their daughter. And there was no guarantee he wouldn't try to come to the U.S. to reclaim her. She contacted the FBI and the U.S. Marshals Service, hoping for some form of protection. Both agencies gave the same response. They were reactive, not preventive. They could not act unless a crime had already occurred. No restraining order could stop an international custody abduction, and if Moody showed up in Michigan, legally there was little that could stop him from taking Mahtob back to Iran. The house became a fortress. Doors that had never needed locks now had new bolts. Betty's father kept his rifle loaded. Her brothers took shifts being alert. Any knock on the door or anonymous phone call sent waves of fear through the household. Betty didn't answer unknown calls. They didn't know if Moody was already trying to reach out. Betty had escaped Iran, but she hadn't escaped the fear. At night, Betty slept on edge, often fully clothed, just in case. Her mind replayed the beatings, the surveillance, the neighbors who reported on her, and the days of cold hunger on the mountain. Mahtob, too, was changed. Loud noises like thunder or passing planes triggered panic. A low-flying aircraft caused her to run and hide in the living room, crying and trembling. She had experienced air raids in Tehran. Bombs, fires, sirens. In her mind, every sound of danger still echoed from that past. Though Betty was back, she now faced a completely different reality. She had no job, no savings. Moody had wired all their money from the U.S. to Iran after she arrived there in 1984. Their home had been sold. She had cashed in her small retirement account just to survive. On top of that, she owed $12,000 to the man who had arranged their escape. Most people urged her to forget the debt, but she had made a promise, and she intended to keep it. She walked into the National Bank of Detroit in Alpena, the last place she had lived before Iran, and met with a bank officer. She explained her situation. The officer believed in her. That same day, she walked out with $12,000 in cash, which she wired to an anonymous account abroad. She later said that moment of trust and dignity restored something inside her. The media wanted her story. The phone began to ring, not from Moody, but from journalists. Her first major opportunity came when Barbara Walters invited her to appear on 2020. Betty, overwhelmed, initially declined. Her father had just entered another critical phase, but the media interest didn't stop. She agreed to the interview, seeing it as a way to protect herself. The more public she became, the harder it would be for Moody to act without scrutiny. Shortly after, she signed with the William Morris Agency. They helped connect her with William Hoffer, who would become her co-author and confidant. Together, they wrote the memoir Not Without My Daughter, detailing every moment of her journey, from the marriage to the captivity to the escape. But the emotional cost of reliving the trauma was high. Some members of Betty's extended family didn't want to talk about Iran. They were relieved she was home, but didn't understand why she needed to tell the story. That was a bad time. Why can't you just forget it? They asked. But she couldn't forget. Mahtob couldn't forget. Their silence could help no one. As she continued writing and speaking, Betty began building a new mission: to warn other women about the legal and cultural dangers of international custody laws. She was learning, painfully, that American citizenship didn't follow you across borders, and that marrying someone from another culture could have consequences no one had ever warned her about. Even as Betty found her voice, her father's health declined further. She had made it home just in time. For weeks, she slept next to his hospital bed in the living room. She brought him water, listened to his stories, and shared quiet moments of gratitude. In July, after one of his many surgeries, he briefly woke up from a coma and told her he had seen bright skies, green valleys, and his twin brother. He was at peace. He passed away on August 3rd, 1986, exactly 2 years to the day after Betty and Mahtob first arrived in Tehran. Betty believed he had held on just long enough to see them safe. In the months that followed, Betty and Mahtob moved out of her parents' home. They began life again, cautiously, privately, but with growing purpose. Mahtob started school under an assumed name. Betty spoke to women's groups, advocacy organizations, and eventually, millions of readers. She never called herself a hero. But she had done something few others could. She had kept her promise. She had brought her daughter home. In school, Mahtob struggled at first. She had been taught to read and write in Farsi while in Iran, but her English had fallen behind. Her classmates were reading books she couldn't yet understand, but Mahtob was determined. She worked hard, often staying up with her mother to practice spelling and vocabulary. Her teachers noted that she was a quiet but deeply attentive student. She rarely spoke in class, but when she did, her thoughts were clear and precise. What gave Mahtob strength, more than anything else, was her faith. Despite all she had endured, she held on to a sense of hope. This hope grew into a strong Christian belief that would later become central to her healing. One of her first personal choices after returning home was to ask to be baptized. Betty was surprised but deeply moved. They scheduled the baptism for January 29, 1987, the one-year anniversary of their escape from Iran. Mahtob's entire first-grade class came to witness it. In her prayers at home, she began to include her father. She had once said she wished he had died in a plane crash. Now she prayed for his well-being. This was not because she forgot what he had done, but because she chose to let go of hatred. Betty nurtured's process. They would sit together and talk about the past, not to dwell in it, but to understand it. Betty reminded her that Moody had once been a good father, that he had shown love before things changed. Mahtob was allowed to remember both the pain and the kindness. Her trauma still showed in subtle ways. She kept broken pens that had once belonged to her father. She hid them in her drawers. She listened to Persian music on cassette tapes in private. She had nightmares and sometimes woke up in tears. But with each year, she found more peace. Her mother supported her with patience, and her family created a circle of protection that gave her room to breathe. When she reached adulthood, Mahtob made the decision to tell her story in her own words. Her 2015 memoir, My Name is Mahtob, was a continuation, not a contradiction, of her mother's famous book. In it, Mahtob shared the long-term impact of her experience. The anxiety, the years of hiding, the strength she drew from her faith, and the importance of forgiveness. She described how she turned to literature and quiet reflection to process the past. She didn't sensationalize the events. Instead, she offered clarity and honesty. Mahtob's journey was not about revenge or bitterness. It was about finding stability after chaos. Her life became an example of how a child survivor can grow up without being defined by fear. Through her writing, she encouraged other survivors of trauma to speak, to trust, and to heal. She spoke of grace, courage, and the quiet power of faith. Her story, first told through the eyes of her mother and then through her own, remains one of strength, resilience, and the enduring bond between parent and child. When Not Without My Daughter was published in 1987, it was immediately met with widespread public interest and strong emotional reactions. Betty Mahmoudi's first-hand account of being held in Iran with her young daughter Mahtob for 18 months, against her will and without legal recourse, struck a nerve with readers around the world. The story was gripping. A mother trapped in a country whose laws did not recognize her rights, battling a system that viewed her husband as her legal master, ultimately risking her life to escape with her daughter over the mountains into Turkey. But as powerful and widely accepted as Betty's account became, not everyone agreed with the version of events she presented. Especially the man at the center of her accusations, her Iranian husband, Dr. Syed Bozorg Moody Mahmoudi. For years following the release of the book and the 1991 film adaptation starring Sally Field, Moody remained largely silent in public, but behind the scenes he was deeply angry about how he was portrayed. According to him, the depiction was false, one-sided, and damaging not just to his reputation but also to his relationship with his daughter, Mahtob. In 2002, nearly 15 years after the publication of the book, Moody took his story to the screen in a German-produced documentary titled Without My Daughter. This film was presented as a direct response to Betty's claims. It gave Moody a platform to speak his truth, to offer his version of events, and to push back against what he called a fabricated narrative created by his ex-wife. In the documentary, Moody appears soft-spoken and composed, often shown walking through parks or sitting calmly in interviews. He begins by stating that he was deeply in love with Betty and that their daughter Mahtob meant the world to him. He insists that he had no intention of keeping them in Iran permanently and claims Betty misrepresented their trip as a kidnapping when, according to him, she knew they were going to stay longer than 2 weeks. Moody also strongly denies that he ever abused Betty or Mahtob. He claims that their life in Iran was not as grim or dangerous as described in the book, and that Betty exaggerated or invented situations to portray herself as a victim and him as a villain. He insists that the decision to stay in Iran was mutual and that Betty's eventual escape with their daughter was a betrayal, not just of him, but of the family and country that had welcomed them. The documentary includes interviews with several of Moody's Iranian relatives, neighbors, and acquaintances. Most of them support his version of events, speaking warmly of him and criticizing Betty's account as culturally insensitive and unfair. These interviewees describe Betty as cold and ungrateful, someone who disrespected their traditions and refused to integrate. Some even suggest that her book was motivated by a desire for fame or financial gain. One of the most emotional parts of the film is Moody's description of how he lost contact with his daughter. He describes the pain of not knowing where Mahtob is or how she is doing. He alleges that Betty used legal mechanisms in the United States to keep him away from Mahtob, refusing him any form of visitation or communication. In the film, Moody tearfully reads letters he claims to have written to his daughter, letters that were never answered or even acknowledged. The documentary also criticizes the 1991 Hollywood film Not Without My Daughter. Despite these efforts to clear his name, the documentary did not achieve the same global reach or influence as the book or the Hollywood film. Its distribution was limited, and its reception varied depending on audience. In Iran and among some Muslim communities, the film was embraced as a long-overdue rebuttal. In many Western circles, however, it was viewed with skepticism. Critics of Without My Daughter noted several issues. First, the documentary presented no independent verification of Moody's claims. Most of the sources were either his relatives or individuals closely tied to him, with no neutral perspectives included. Second, Moody failed to address specific documented actions, such as his control over the family's passports, his sudden announcement in Tehran that they would not return to the U.S., and the legal limitations Betty faced under Iranian law that prevented her from leaving the country with her child. Moreover, the timeline of events in the documentary did not align with official records. For instance, U.S. Embassy documents and sworn statements from Swiss officials confirmed Betty's attempts to seek help and her legal status while trapped in Iran. Her claims were further supported by Mahtob's school and medical records, as well as testimony from individuals involved in her escape. Betty Moody chose not to participate in the documentary. She stated that she had already told her story through her book and interviews, and that revisiting the trauma publicly would not benefit her or her daughter. In interviews around that time, she reiterated that every major claim in her book could be backed up by evidence or corroborated by others involved in the case. Mahtob, still a child when the documentary was released, did not comment publicly at the time. However, more than a decade later, she published her own memoir titled My Name is Mahtob, in which she directly addressed the claims made in the rebuttal film. In her book, Mahtob confirms her mother's version of events and shares her own memories of fear, punishment, and control during their time in Iran. She recalls the trauma of not being allowed to speak freely, the beatings her mother endured, and the overwhelming sense of being trapped. She also describes the toll the experience took on her life afterward: panic attacks, PTSD, and the constant fear that her father might one day find and take her back to Iran. According to Mahtob, her father's efforts to reconnect with her never felt sincere. Instead, they felt like another form of pressure and control, one that ignored the emotional and psychological damage she had suffered. In My Name is Mahtob, she also discusses watching the Without My Daughter documentary as a teenager. Her response was a mix of anger and disbelief. She felt that the man on the screen was not the same person who had isolated and threatened them in Iran. For her, the documentary was an attempt to rewrite history and gain sympathy without acknowledging harm. The public response to the documentary reflected the broader tension surrounding stories of cross-cultural marriages, child custody, and the portrayal of Islamic societies in Western media. Supporters of Moody accused the West of promoting Islamophobia and silencing dissenting voices. They argued that Betty's story painted all Iranian men with the same brush and overlooked the complex legal and cultural realities of life in post-revolution Iran. Supporters of Betty, on the other hand, pointed to the consistency of her narrative across decades, the corroboration from Western authorities, and the broader pattern of parental-child abduction cases that matched her experience. They emphasized that her book was not an indictment of all Iranian people, but a personal account of how one legal system and one man trapped a mother and child in a dangerous situation. The case of Betty and Mahtob Moody became a touchpoint in international discussions about international child custody laws, women's rights, and cross-cultural marriages. It highlighted the gaps in protection for parents whose children are taken to countries where local laws override foreign custody arrangements. It also showed how difficult it is for courts and governments to intervene once someone is across the border. In the United States, Betty's story contributed to greater public awareness of international parental abduction. It played a role in advocacy efforts that eventually led to the International Parental Kidnapping Crime Act of 1993, which made it a federal offense to remove a child from the U.S. to obstruct another parent's custodial rights. Betty herself became an advocate, speaking to lawmakers and participating in public awareness campaigns. Even as the years passed, the debate between the two sides never fully quieted. Moody continued to insist on his innocence until his death. Betty stood by her original testimony, and Mahtob, who had grown up in the shadow of the story, chose to move forward while still honoring the truth of her experience. For audiences watching these events unfold from the outside, the story remained deeply emotional and complex. It was about more than just a family conflict. It was about power, control, justice, and the right to be safe with your child. It was about the difficulty of proving the truth when two people see the same events in entirely different ways, and when the legal and cultural systems around them refuse to acknowledge the full reality. If this story moved you, we encourage you to keep the conversation going. Subscribe to our channel for more real-life documentaries that matter. Like this video if you believe in the power of a mother's love. Comment below what stood out most to you about Betty and Mahtob's journey. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story that needs to be told. And if you want to explore their full story, we highly recommend reading Not Without My Daughter by Betty Moody, For the Love of a Child by Betty Moody, My Name is Mahtob by Mahtob Moody. Thank you for watching, and remember, every voice matters, every story counts.